I never believed the house would feel this empty. Not after years of silence between my father and me, not after all the arguments and the slammed doors, but when I stepped inside after the funeral, the weight of it pressed on my chest like I had walked into a tomb built only for one. The curtains were drawn the way he always kept them, half shut against the world, as though even daylight wasn't to be trusted. Dust floated in the air in thin, accusing strands, catching what little sun forced its way through. I should have left immediately, but something pulled me deeper into those rooms, into the faint smell of pipe smoke that still clung to the walls, into the corners where his books leaned against one another like weary sentries. I told myself I was only there to collect paperwork, to clear the debts, to make sure the bank couldn't strip away what little was left. But then I found the drawer. It wasn't even locked, just hidden beneath a false panel in his desk, the same oak desk he had sat behind for as long as I could remember, his shoulders always squared, his voice always edged with finality. I had run my hand across its surface 100 times as a boy, waiting for permission to leave the room, waiting for judgment or disappointment. Now my fingers brushed the panel, and it clicked loose with a sound so sharp it seemed to echo through the house. Inside was a ledger. No title, no ornament, just a leather-bound book worn soft at the edges, the corners cracked with use. I opened it without thinking, expecting numbers, dates, business transactions, the kind of meticulous accounting my father lived by. But it wasn't that. The first page bore a single word, handwritten in ink that had faded but not enough to hide the intention. Debts. Underneath, in neat columns, were names. Some I recognized, neighbors, distant relatives, men I had heard mentioned in passing at the dinner table. Next to each was a note. Owed a favor. Paid with silence. Taken without return. I flipped further, my pulse rising, and the entries grew stranger. Saved from drowning, lifelong debt. Stole what he could not pay. Took her voice, left her broken. It read less like bookkeeping and more like judgment, as though he had measured people's lives, weighed them on some private scale, and written down the results. At first I laughed, nervously, alone in that room that had no right to still feel like his. Surely it was metaphor, some grim philosophy he entertained in private. But then I saw the dates. Each entry was precise. Each one lined up with moments I could recall, tragedies whispered about in the village, rumors that never quite made sense. And on the final page, scrawled in his sharp, controlled script, was my name. No explanation, no date, no detail. Just my name, underlined once. The ledger slipped from my hands and hit the desk with a dull thud. For a moment I couldn't move. My throat tightened and my skin went cold. Why would he write my name there? What did he mean? My father was not a man given to sentimentality. If he had written it, it had purpose, and that purpose was staring back at me like a sentence already handed down. I shoved the book shut and backed away, but it was as if the room had shifted around me. The dust in the air seemed thicker, the light dimmer, the house angrier. I could hear his voice again, calm and cutting. Every man must settle his debts. I thought I had buried that voice with him in the ground, but here it was, pressing into me from the silence. I should have walked out then, should have left the ledger where I found it, and never looked back. But when I tried to leave, something pulled me back to the desk. My hands moved without me, opening the ledger again, flipping through names and notes like a man possessed. I stopped on one that made my stomach drop. Thomas Gray took a life, unpaid. Thomas Gray had been my uncle. He had died when I was 15, a sudden accident, they said, though no one spoke of it after. Reading my father's words, it no longer seemed like an accident at all. I sank into the chair, my legs weak, and stared at the ink. A memory stirred, one I had buried for years. My father's hand gripping my shoulder too tightly as men carried Thomas's body away, his words low and deliberate. Remember what is owed. At the time I hadn't understood. Now, reading this, I realized I had never really tried. The more I read, the more the past rearranged itself around me. Neighbors who had vanished, debts that had broken families, whispered stories of ruin and betrayal. They were all here, in his hand. Each life reduced to a line in his private book of reckoning. And at the end of it, me. No explanation, just the name he had given me, as though I too were a line item, an unresolved account waiting to be collected. The sound of the ledger shutting echoed louder than it should have. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the house, once heavy with grief, now thrummed with something else, expectation. As though by opening that drawer I had stepped into a contract I didn't understand. I carried the book to the kitchen table, sat in the same chair he had sat in every morning, and opened it again, daring it to give me more. And that's when I noticed the space left beneath my name. Blank. Waiting. The pen lay beside it, as if he had set it down only yesterday. The next morning, I woke with the ledger still open on the table, the inked names burned into my mind like scars I couldn't wash away. I had not slept so much as drifted in and out of fractured dreams where my father's voice narrated every entry, where each name rose from the page like a ghost demanding payment. The house seemed alive with those demands, the floorboards creaking with accusation, the pipes groaning with restless anger. I tried to convince myself it was only exhaustion, grief, the residue of too many years estranged from a man I barely understood. But when I opened the ledger again and saw my own name still waiting, blank beneath it, I felt the cold certainty that it was no dream. My father had left me something more dangerous than inheritance. He had left me a responsibility or a curse. I carried the book outside, desperate for light, for fresh air to banish the shadows clinging to me. But even in daylight the ledger looked wrong, its leather dark as spilled oil, the edges faintly sticky under my fingers. I walked to the edge of the garden, where the soil still held the marks of his funeral procession, and I considered burning it. Matches trembled in my hand, the flame flaring bright against the morning wind, but when I lowered it toward the leather, the fire hissed and sputtered out as though the book had rejected it. I tried again, furious, striking match after match, but each time the flame died before it could touch the cover. The book would not burn. It wanted to remain. Shaken, I shoved it into my satchel and walked to town, hoping distance might dull its pull. But the closer I drew to people, the heavier the ledger felt, as if it knew it was surrounded by names, by potential entries. When I passed the baker's shop, I remembered hearing of his brother's scandal years ago, debts unpaid, prison whispers. When I crossed paths with old Mrs. Lorne, stooped and mumbling to herself, I recalled the rumors of how she had cheated neighbors during the war. The ledger seemed to vibrate, hungry for their stories, and I pressed the satchel tighter to my side, terrified that somehow it would open of its own accord. At the cafe, I tried to sit and drink, to pretend I was normal, but my childhood friend Henry slid into the chair across from me, his expression wary. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, and I almost laughed at the accuracy. When I told him about the ledger, his face drained of color. "Your father's book?" he whispered, as if naming it gave it life. People always said he kept records, but no one ever knew how deep it went. Some thought he was protecting us. Others thought, he trailed off, glancing around. Others thought he was the one pulling the strings behind half the tragedies in this town. I wanted to dismiss it as gossip, but Henry leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Do you remember the fire at the mill, back in '93? Everyone said it was faulty wiring. But I heard my father once say your old man knew it was coming, that he had written it down before it happened." He stared at me, waiting for me to deny it, but all I could do was grip the satchel until my knuckles went white. The ledger was no mere record. It was something more, something that anticipated, maybe even dictated. When I returned home that evening, I swore I heard footsteps in the hall though no one else had a key. I searched each room, the dust unbroken, the windows shut, but the air quivered with presence. On the desk, the ledger lay open though I knew I had locked it away. Another name had appeared, fresh ink glistening under the lamp. Henry Whitaker, betrayal pending. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the book. The entry hadn't been there before. I had been with Henry all afternoon, listening to his warnings, his fear. Betrayal pending? What could that mean? I wanted to believe it was a trick of memory, that my father had written it years ago, and I had simply overlooked it. But the ink was too new, the lines too sharp. The book was writing itself. I slammed it shut and locked it in the desk again. But all night I lay awake, hearing the faint scratch of a pen against paper though no one else was in the house. By dawn I could not bear it any longer. I tore the ledger out again, desperate to see what had been added, and my stomach twisted when I found the page. Beneath Henry's name, 2 words had appeared since last night. Debt collected. I raced into town, heart pounding, ignoring the chill in my veins. At the cafe where we had sat only yesterday, the tables were overturned, People gathered outside in whispers. Someone told me Henry had been found in the river at dawn, drowned though he was known to be a strong swimmer. His wife swore she had seen him walking home hours before, perfectly sober, no sign of despair. But there he was, gone, another name in my father's cursed account. I staggered away from the crowd, the satchel slamming against my side, the ledger heavier than stone. If the book could record debts before they happened, if it could decide how they were paid, then Henry's warning had not been paranoia. My father had left me not an inheritance, but a weapon, one that could not be destroyed, one that demanded balance in blood and silence. And now it had claimed the life of the only friend I still trusted. That night I sat again at the desk, the ledger open before me, my father's pen cold in my hand. My name still waited at the end, blank, patient. But beside it, as if mocking me, new words had begun to form in faint, unfinished strokes, as though an invisible hand was waiting for me to notice. Choice pending. For days after Henry's death, I did not leave the house, unable to face the town's whispers, the accusatory glances that seemed to pierce through my skin. Every conversation carried a weight I couldn't bear. Neighbors asking politely if I was all right, their eyes lingering with suspicion, their voices tightening as if they expected me to confess some hidden role. The ledger stayed on my desk, open no matter how many times I shut it, the ink crawling slowly across its pages with a will of its own. I had tried everything, locking it away, hiding it beneath floorboards, even burying it in the yard, but each morning I found it again in the study, waiting, patient, as though the house itself conspired to return it to me. My father's presence pressed down on me with suffocating insistence, his ledger the tether he had left behind. I feared I would lose my mind before I discovered the truth of why he had chosen me to inherit it. It was on the fourth night, when I sat staring at the words "choice pending" beside my name, that the knock came at the door. 3 deliberate raps, heavy enough to echo through the silent hall. I froze, unsure whether to answer, my heart hammering with dread. Few people visited now, most too afraid or disgusted after Henry's death, and those who did rarely linger past daylight. Yet the knocking came again, insistent, demanding. Slowly, against every instinct, I opened the door. A woman stood there, cloaked against the rain, her face pale, eyes sharp with something between curiosity and recognition. "You don't know me," she said without introduction, her voice steady though her hands trembled as she clutched a satchel of her own. "But I knew your father, and I know what you found." My stomach lurched, my grip on the door tightening. "The ledger?" I asked before I could stop myself, and her silence was confirmation enough. She introduced herself as Eleanor, a historian by trade, though she admitted her work often blurred the line between scholarship and obsession. "Your father was not the first," she told me as she stepped into the study, her gaze settling on the ledger with something like awe. "There have been others, scattered through centuries, across continents. The journals always appear in times of great upheaval, always passed down through blood or circumstance, never destroyed. I have tracked them most of my life, but I never expected to find another here." Her words both chilled and steadied me. For the first time since my father's death, I was not alone in carrying this burden. Yet as she opened her satchel and laid out photocopies of brittle manuscripts, faded sketches of symbols, and letters written in hands long dead, I felt my dread deepen. Each example mirrored my father's ledger, bound in unyielding leather, pages that refused decay, ink that never faded. Some wrote of debts, others of bargains, some even of prophecies, Eleanor explained, tracing her finger over an image of a ledger nearly identical to mine. But always the same pattern, names inscribed, fates sealed, lives claimed in payment. Those who inherited them rarely lived long. I wanted to shut the book and walk away, to pretend her knowledge offered me freedom, but instead I found myself asking, why me? Why my father? He was a cruel man, but this, my voice cracked, and Eleanor regarded me with unsettling sympathy. "Because the ledgers choose," she said softly. "They are not heirlooms in the ordinary sense. They find hosts, vessels willing or unwilling, and through them they maintain balance or punishment or something we cannot yet name." As she spoke, the ledger stirred, its pages fluttering though no breeze touched the room. Both of us froze, watching as a fresh name bled onto the paper in ink darker than midnight. Eleanor Gray, truth approaching. My breath caught. She leaned closer, unflinching despite the terror I felt. So it acknowledges me, she murmured, half to herself. Then perhaps this is not coincidence after all. That night we pored over the entries together, piecing fragments of meaning from the chaos. Eleanor noticed patterns I had overlooked, cycles of deaths repeating every decade, names of families who seemed bound to the ledger across generations. She traced a finger down the page where my own name lingered, unfinished, and her expression darkened. Choice pending, she read aloud. That means it hasn't decided your debt yet. You may still have agency, but agency comes with a cost. Her words haunted me as we argued over possibilities. If the ledger demanded balance, could I repay its debts without blood? Could I choose mercy over cruelty? Or would refusal itself count as betrayal? The more we debated, the more the air thickened, as if the book thrived on our uncertainty. At last Eleanor slammed it shut, her eyes fierce. We cannot let it write for us, she said. If we allow it, it will dictate every name, every outcome. But if we act first, if we write, we might alter the cycle. The idea horrified me, yet a spark of defiance lit within me. To write in the ledger, to claim power rather than submit, it felt dangerous, blasphemous, but perhaps it was the only way. I lifted the pen, my hand trembling, and for the first time since inheriting it, I poised to inscribe. The page beneath my fingers seemed to pulse like living flesh, awaiting my decision. Eleanor's voice was urgent beside me. Write a test. Something small. A name you can bear. But the pen moved of its own accord, my hand guided by a force colder and older than myself. Letters scrawled in jagged strokes across the page, a name I had not intended but recognized with a jolt of horror. Eleanor gasped, eyes wide. On the paper, clear as prophecy, it read, Eleanor Gray, debt pending. The lamp flickered violently, shadows twisting along the walls as if unseen hands had filled the room. Eleanor ripped the pen from my grip, fury and fear warring in her face. You let it choose, she hissed. Do you understand what this means? It has bound me now. My life is tied to its payment. The ledger lay open between us, the ink glistening like fresh blood, and I realized too late that whatever alliance we had formed carried a price neither of us yet understood. The days that followed were a descent into chaos, each hour marked by the sense that the walls of the house no longer belonged to me, but to the ledger itself. Its presence filled every corner, its weight pressing down until sleep became impossible and meals turned to ash in my mouth. Eleanor remained, though I half expected her to flee after her name appeared upon the page. She moved through the house like a restless spirit, gathering her papers, scrawling notes, muttering theories under her breath. Yet every time our eyes met, I saw the anger simmering just beneath the surface, a fury directed as much at me as at the cursed object that had bound us together. I tried to apologize, to explain that I had not meant to write her name, but she silenced me with a look sharp enough to cut glass. It doesn't matter what you meant, she said once, her voice hoarse. Intention is irrelevant to the ledger. It records. It binds. It collects. Those words echoed through me like a sentence passed. At night, I heard whispers seeping through the walls, voices calling from the pages, voices I recognized. Henry's pleading, my father's commands, neighbors' gossip, all twisted into a chorus urging me to surrender. Sometimes I thought I heard Eleanor's voice among them, begging me to undo what I had done, though when I looked at her she would only shake her head, pretending nothing was wrong. The town, too, seemed to close in. People stopped me in the street, their questions more pointed, their suspicions more open. Some swore they saw shadows flit across the windows of my house when no lamps were lit. Others whispered that I had made a pact with something unholy, that Henry's death was only the beginning. And though I wished to deny it, deep down I wondered if they were right. One evening, as the rain lashed against the glass and thunder rattled the beams, Eleanor confronted me in the study. The ledger lay open on the desk, its ink pulsing faintly like veins beneath skin. We can't stay here, she declared, her hands clenched at her sides. It's feeding on us, on this place. We have to destroy it. I laughed bitterly, exhaustion twisting my words. Destroy it? You saw what happened when I buried it. It came back. It will always come back. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. Not if we take it to the root. These things, they don't survive on their own. They are tied to something, ritual, bloodline, place. If we sever that tie, maybe we sever its hold. Her conviction should have inspired hope, but all I felt was dread. Still, that night we planned. She believed the ledger's origins were tied not just to my father, but to the land itself, the house built on ground older than memory. She spoke of an old chapel in the woods, abandoned long ago, where her research suggested other ledgers had been consecrated, bound to their keepers by rites long forgotten. If there was anywhere to break the cycle, it was there. I wanted to believe her, yet part of me suspected she already knew the truth, that she was marked now, and she was grasping for any chance, no matter how slim, to free herself. We set out at dawn, the ledger wrapped in cloth and strapped tight against my chest. The forest closed in quickly, branches clawing at our clothes, the air thick with the damp rot of centuries. Eleanor led with grim determination, her lantern swaying in the mist, but I could feel the book twitch against me, its heartbeat quickening the deeper we pressed into the trees. By midday we reached the chapel, a crumbling ruin swallowed by ivy and silence. Its stones radiated cold even through the fog, and as we stepped inside, I felt the ledger grow heavier, as though it recognized its birthplace. Inside, Eleanor laid out her notes, chalking symbols on the cracked floor, arranging candles in precise patterns. Her hands trembled, but her focus never wavered, her voice steady as she recited fragments of forgotten prayers. I placed the ledger at the center, its cover slick with condensation that might have been sweat, and for a moment I thought I heard it breathing. The ritual began. The candles flared, shadows stretching impossibly long, and the air grew so thick it pressed against my chest like a fist. Eleanor chanted louder, her voice raw, the symbols glowing faintly as though alive. I wanted to believe it would work, that the weight would lift, but then the ledger opened of its own accord and the pages turned furiously, faster than wind could carry them. Names spilled forth, hundreds, thousands, voices erupting from the paper in a cacophony that shook the stones. The sound was unbearable, grief and rage and terror all at once. Eleanor screamed for me to hold it down, but as I pressed my hands against the book, searing pain lanced through my palms, as if the ink itself were burning into my flesh. I tried to wrench away, but my hands would not move, the ledger fusing to me, demanding my submission. Eleanor grasped my shoulders, pulling, begging me to let go, but the more she pulled, the louder the voices became until the walls of the chapel cracked and dust rained from above. Then, above the roar, a single voice cut clear, my father's. "Finish it," he commanded, his tone the same one that had haunted my childhood, the voice of obedience demanded and punished if denied. "Write the name. Seal the debt." My vision blurred, my body trembling with exhaustion, but in that moment I understood. The ledger would not release us until another name was given, another debt claimed. Eleanor's face was pale in the candlelight, her eyes wide with both terror and resolve. "Don't you dare," she whispered. "Don't you give it me." And yet the pen was in my hand, the page before me waiting, the ink already seeping from the tip as if anticipating her name. My heart pounded with the impossible choice: sacrifice her to save myself, or resist and be consumed along with her. I wanted to throw the pen away, to scream that I would not play its game, but my father's voice thundered louder, shaking the chapel with every word. "Right." The candles blew out, plunging us into darkness, and the last thing I saw was the ledger glowing with its own light, the blank space beneath Eleanor's name widening like a wound waiting to be filled. The chapel was swallowed in darkness, yet the glow of the ledger remained, an eerie pulse that cast long, shifting shadows across the cracked stone floor. My hands still clung to the book, though I no longer felt flesh and bone but fire and ink, as if I had become part of the pages themselves. Eleanor's grip on my shoulder tightened, and her breath came fast against my ear. "Fight it," she hissed, her words ragged. "You are not your father. You do not have to obey." But the voice of my father rolled through the chamber like thunder, demanding obedience as he always had, every syllable reverberating inside my skull. "Right, boy. Right, and end it." For an instant I saw his face materialize in the flickering glow, eyes like burning coals, mouth curved in a cruel sneer that had haunted me even in childhood dreams. Eleanor tore the pen from my hand and flung it across the chapel, her defiance sharp as the crack of lightning. "You don't control him," she shouted into the echoing dark. "Not anymore." Her courage should have filled me with strength, yet even as the pen clattered against the stones, the ledger bled new ink, forming another quill from its spine, the pages thirsting for blood. My fingers reached toward it involuntarily, drawn like iron to a magnet, and in that moment I realized the cruelest truth. It did not simply demand obedience, it reshaped will itself, turning desire into chains. The floor trembled. The stones groaned as fissures spread, dust cascading from the ceiling. The chapel felt alive, a lung inhaling centuries of misery. Eleanor grabbed my face, forcing my eyes to hers. Her voice cracked, but her resolve was unbroken. "If you give it me, you'll lose yourself forever. But if you refuse, maybe, just maybe, we can destroy it together." Her words sliced through the fog, but then another voice rose. Henry's voice, my brother's, mournful and desperate. "Please," he begged, "finish what Father started. Only then will I rest." His face appeared beside Eleanor's, not flesh but ink, spectral and shifting, his eyes full of pain. I was torn in half, the ledger pulling with the strength of generations, Eleanor anchoring me with nothing but human will. My body shook violently, my palms blistering against the binding heat of the book. The names on the pages shrieked louder, swelling into a hurricane of grief that rattled the very bones in my chest. Then, in a moment of clarity, I saw what my father had never wanted me to see. The ledger was not only a record but a prison. Every name written bound a soul, every entry a chain forged by a hand that believed it was saving itself. Henry was not free. He was trapped because Father had written his name long before death took him. "Eleanor," I gasped, the realization cracking through me like dawn. "It isn't just collecting. It's holding them. It's keeping them here." Her eyes widened as the truth pierced her. "Then we must break it," she said. "Not by writing, by burning every name from its memory." She drew a flask from her satchel, one she had filled with kerosene before we left the house, her last desperate contingency. But as she uncorked it, the ledger screeched, 1,000 voices screaming as one. The air itself turned solid, pinning her against the wall, her limbs thrashing as invisible hands clawed at her throat. I lunged, but the ledger's weight chained me down, dragging me closer to the center of the circle as if it meant to devour me whole. My father's voice roared again. "You will obey? Right, or she dies." Eleanor choked, her face turning pale, yet even as the spectral grip closed, she managed to rasp out a single word: resist. That word was my anchor. I clutched the ledger with both scorched hands and screamed into the void, not with my father's name, nor Henry's, nor Eleanor's, but with my own. "Take me." The moment the words left my lips, the book shuddered violently, ink spilling across the floor in rivers that hissed like acid. The grip on Eleanor released, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping, while the ledger clung to me with the ferocity of a drowning beast. Eleanor crawled toward the spilled flask, her fingers trembling as she splashed kerosene across the pages that writhed beneath my hands. The smell of fuel filled the chapel, overpowering even the rot of the ancient stones. My father's face emerged once more from the glow, his eyes blazing with fury. "You fool," he spat, "you'll damn us all." But I no longer cared for his judgment. I was no longer his son chained to obedience. I was my own master at last. "Then let us all be damned," I whispered, and Eleanor struck the flint. Flames erupted, racing along the ledger's spine, consuming the pages as they screamed in 1,000 voices of agony and release. The fire spread in unnatural patterns, curling outward in tendrils of light that clawed at the walls, the ceiling, the very air. The ground split open beneath us, the chapel groaning as though torn apart by the weight of centuries of bound souls breaking free. Eleanor dragged me back, my hands still fused to the burning ledger, flesh blistering as ink seared into my skin. But for every scream there came a sigh, for every shriek a whisper of relief, until I realized that the fire was not only destruction, it was liberation. The final page curled in flame and disintegrated into ash, and with it the glow of the ledger died. My father's voice cut off mid-command. Henry's face dissolved into smoke, and the cacophony of voices fell silent, replaced by a vast emptiness that pressed against my ears until I thought I had gone deaf. The ledger collapsed into a husk, brittle and black, and I fell with it, my body convulsing as though something immense had been ripped from me. Eleanor caught me, cradling my head as tears streaked her soot-stained cheeks. "It's done," she whispered. "It has to be done." But as I lay there trembling in her arms, the silence felt wrong, unnatural. For in the hollow where the voices had been, I sensed something waiting, something vast and patient, watching from the darkness left behind. And in the dying embers of the ledger, etched faintly in the charred remains, one word lingered, my own name. The chapel smoldered, the walls streaked with soot, the air thick with ash that clung to our lungs and hair. Eleanor and I lay side by side on the cracked stone floor, staring at the dying embers where the ledger had burned itself to ruin. For the first time since we entered that cursed place, there was no hum of voices, no spectral shadows clawing at the edges of my vision. Only silence. A silence so absolute that it rang in my ears like a bell struck and left to fade. Eleanor coughed, wiping grime from her lips. "It's gone," she whispered, though her voice carried little conviction. "We destroyed it." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to imagine that the cries had been those of souls released, not damned. But the word burned into the last page, my name, haunted me with its quiet insistence. I pulled myself upright, every muscle aching, my hands scorched raw where the ledger had fused with my skin. Charred lines now ran across my palms like veins of ink, too deep to be merely burns. They throbbed with a faint pulse, as though something beneath them still lived. I flexed my fingers and bit back a cry. Eleanor's eyes caught the markings, and her expression tightened. "It marked you," she said, voice low and fearful. "The book may be ash, but it left its claim." Her words wrapped around me like chains. My father had tried to bind me in obedience my entire life, and even now, even in death, he had succeeded in leaving his imprint upon me. We staggered from the chapel into the night, the forest beyond the ruins thick with mist. The world outside felt changed, sharper somehow, as though the air itself recognized what had been unleashed within. Owls were silent, wind still, the trees watching in their immovable way. Every shadow stirred with possibility. As we trudged along the path back to the village, Eleanor clutched my arm not out of affection but necessity, her steps unsteady, her silence heavy with unspoken fears. Finally she asked, "Do you feel them? The voices?" I shook my head, though the truth was worse. I didn't hear them, but I sensed them, like a pressure just outside of hearing, a tide swelling behind the dam of my mind. The villagers awaited our return. Lanterns lined the road, faces pale and expectant. They had seen the fire rising above the treetops, the ruin of the chapel glowing against the sky. When we emerged, they crowded us with questions. "Is it done? Are we free? Has the ledger been destroyed?" Eleanor, ever the anchor, lifted her chin and declared, "It is gone. Its hold is broken." Relief rippled through the crowd, some collapsing to their knees in prayer, others weeping openly. Yet as they celebrated, I stood apart, the weight of my burned hands pressed into my sides, knowing I carried something no fire could erase. That night they gave us shelter, food, warmth by the hearth. But sleep evaded me. Every time I closed my eyes I saw my father's face in the flames, his mouth curling into the same smirk, as though mocking me even in oblivion. Worse still, I felt his presence stirring within the scars on my palms, a reminder that though the ledger was gone, its essence had not left me. I rose from the bed and stepped outside, the night air cool against my fevered skin. The stars above glittered coldly, indifferent to human struggle. For a moment, I imagined flinging myself into the dark, walking until the earth swallowed me whole, taking with me whatever remnant of the book still lingered. Eleanor found me there, standing beneath the sky with my hands clenched in fists. She touched my shoulder gently. "You're not alone," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Whatever remains, we'll face it together." I wanted to believe her, but deep within I knew the truth. Some burdens cannot be shared. What if it's not finished? I asked. What if burning it only freed what it held, and now it's inside me? Eleanor's silence stretched before she answered. then perhaps the ledger was never meant to be destroyed. Perhaps it chose you to carry what it cannot contain. Her words chilled me, not because of their possibility, but because I feared she was right. Days passed. The villagers returned to their routines, their lives brightened by the belief that the ledger's curse had ended. Yet whispers began to spread, of dreams more vivid than before, of names echoing in sleep, of shadows that seemed too heavy for their size. Some began to look at me strangely, their relief giving way to suspicion. Eleanor shielded me as best she could, insisting I had saved them all, but doubt festered in their eyes. And in the stillness of each night, when I sat alone, I felt the pressure growing inside me, the voices gathering strength, waiting. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Eleanor brought me parchment and ink. She placed them before me without explanation. I recoiled, fear twisting my gut. "No," I said. "I won't write. I won't." She met my eyes, steady and sorrowful. "Maybe it isn't about writing names," she said. "Maybe it's about releasing them. If the ledger bound souls, then you, marked by it, might also unbind them. But only if you're willing to carry their pain." The suggestion filled me with dread, but also a flicker of hope. Could it be true? Could the curse be turned into salvation? That night, alone by the fire, I took the pen. My hand trembled as I wrote the first name I remembered, Henry. The ink bled across the parchment, not black, but golden, a faint shimmer that pulsed like a heartbeat. For a moment the room filled with warmth, and in the silence I thought I heard a sigh, not of torment, but release. Tears burned my eyes. Henry was free. But at the same instant, agony pierced me, sharp as knives, his suffering flooding through me, searing itself into my chest before fading. The parchment crumbled into dust in my hand, leaving only the scars on my palm glowing faintly. I understood then. The ledger's destruction had not erased its work. It had only passed the duty to me. My father had wielded it as a weapon. I must wield it as atonement. Each soul I freed would carve itself deeper into me, until nothing of myself remained. Eleanor returned and saw the change in my eyes, the truth heavy in my shoulders. "You freed him," she said softly. I nodded, unable to speak, for even as I felt Henry's release, I knew countless others remained. "This will kill you," she whispered. "Every name will take a piece of you." My voice cracked as I finally answered. "Then let it. Better me than them." And so I took the first step on a path from which there was no return. The villagers believed the ledger gone, but I knew the truth. I had become the ledger, the prison, and perhaps the key. My father's shadow lingered, watching, waiting, mocking. Yet with each name I would write, each soul I would free, perhaps I could silence him forever. The question that haunted me as I stared into the fire that night was not whether I could carry the burden. It was how long before the voices inside me no longer asked for release, but demanded it.